Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon. My name is Sonja Schmid. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Science and Technology and Society here at Virginia Tech in Northern Virginia in the National Capital Region. And I'm excited to welcome you to SIREN. This is our 10th event. This is a new series of seminars, talks, and discussion on nuclear emergency response. The series is part of my NSF Career Award on globalizing nuclear response. And in the spirit of this type of grant, we emphasize the importance of both research and education in the area of nuclear emergency preparedness and response. All SIREN speakers are meeting with graduate students as part of their engagement, and whenever possible, we plan to provide access to a recording of their lectures. SIREN, the Seminar on Interdisciplinary Research and Education in Nuclear Emergency Response, is generously supported by Virginia Tech's Office of the Vice President for the National Capital Region. Many thanks also to the staff of the Virginia Tech Research Center's Executive Briefing Center and the I-Team for their literally around-the-clock support. And finally, thanks to the students, staff, and faculty in STS and also nuclear engineering for helping to make this happen. Before we get started today, I want to mention that our next event will take place on Thursday, April 7th. That's not what's on the poster. We had to reschedule that. So Thursday, April 7th, here at noon, and our guest will be David Mendonça from RPI, who will discuss cognitive strategies in collaborative improvisation from jazz to 9/11. We're live streaming this talk, and we have over 50 remote participants signed up, last I checked, which was this morning, but RSVPs kept coming in. These attendees are joining us not only from our main campus in Blacksburg, from US universities near and far, federal agencies and national labs, but also from institutions in the UK, Belgium, Canada, Switzerland, and Germany. So welcome to you all. If you're watching us online and would like to submit a question to our speaker, please send an email indicating your name and affiliation to siren@vt.edu. So SIREN, S-I-R-E-N, at VT, as in Virginia Tech.edu. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Daniel Blumenthal manages the consequence management programs in the Office of Emergency Response at the National Nuclear Security Administration within the Department of Energy. In 2009, he transferred from the Department of Homeland Security's Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, where he was the chief test scientist. Prior to joining the federal government, he was a senior scientist at the Department of Energy's Remote Sensing Laboratory from 1996 to 2006, where he managed or provided scientific support to several DOE emergency response teams. In his current position, Dr. Blumenthal led the initial DOE response team to Japan, where he spent a total of 7 weeks following the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident in March 2011. Since then, he has supported many US and international efforts related to lessons learned from Fukushima. Dr. Blumenthal's background is in nuclear physics. He holds a PhD from Yale, and he's also a certified health physicist. Today, he will brief us on DOE's response to Fukushima, with particular emphasis on how our ideas and practices of emergency preparedness and response training have changed, hopefully to the better. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Blumenthal.
Thank you, Sonja, for inviting me, and thank you all for joining us here today. And sorry for sitting, but it's easier than standing for an hour and a half. So I'm going to talk about what we did during our response to the Fukushima accident, and this is with a little bit of a different twist. I've talked about sometimes what we have done, just focusing on the technical activities. I've talked about how our activities are an example of applying, physics in the field. So here I wanted to focus on what we did and how it informed a lot of improvements that hopefully improvements that we've made in the way we organize and the way we train our emergency responders. So I'm going to start with an overview, a summary of what we've done. And if you have any questions and you want more details about what we've done, feel free to ask during it. And then I'll transition to how you'll see, hopefully, how some of the things we learned during our response have informed changes in how we do training and how we organize, and some things that we've added. So that said, on March 11th, we were probably doing what most of the rest of the world was doing, was watching the events in Japan unfold on CNN. We were watching in our operations center, and we actually had some of our initial teams activated just in case. So for example, our atmospheric dispersion modeling team at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, we had them do some what-if modeling. There was nothing that had been reported or confirmed as a nuclear release, but they're there to do that kind of thing, as well as monitoring things that actually happen. And then on March 16th, and then on March 12th, I went to Las Vegas to help get our team together. And the picture on the left of your screen is us actually getting on the U.S. Air Force C-17 at Nellis Air Force Base, right outside of our hangar on the base. So we had 32 people get on the plane, and on March 16th, we got off the plane at Yokota Air Base. And that's where we spent the next 2.5 months supporting the US and Japan. And then on March 17th, so actually on the 16th, we already got set up and started doing things. It was a little different environment. We were supporting on a military base. We weren't involved with our normal group of interagency participants like we have in the United States. There was no national response framework in play. There was no incident command system. So all the training we did was good practice, but everything was a bit improvised, almost like jazz. So on March 17th, we did our first missions over the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And then a few days later, on March 22nd, we published our first aerial survey maps on the DOE website, which is not your normal, in the academic world, you wouldn't consider that publication, but we're trying to get data out to the public and reassure them of what the situation was like. And the Japanese actually were very comforted by us having these independent measurements and publicizing them, because their reputation, having been associated with this accident, it wasn't that great technically. So having an independent entity show what the situation was and how it wasn't that bad, and what the Japanese were saying was accurate. So they liked that, and starting then we built a very close working relationship with the Japanese government, and even did some joint measurements with them, which I'll show you on one of the slides. And our team stayed there until May 28th, when we had the last people head home and back to the United States. So the team, it ranged anywhere from 32 to 35 people. And we rotated every few weeks, so people weren't spending 2.5 months there. Like I spent 3.5 weeks there, got to come home for 2 weeks, worked in our operations center, and then went back to Japan for another 3.5 weeks. So we rotated personnel. And we pulled people from both our headquarters, that's where we do our leadership from, and the experts from the DOE world come from the Department of Energy National Laboratories. And that's where we have health physicists, nuclear physicists, engineers, radiation technicians, GIS scientists, communication specialists, everything you can imagine. And they've been experienced. They do radiation measurements as part of their day job, and some of them have been doing it for decades. On the lower left, Steve Mussolino is one of our health physicists at Brookhaven National Lab. And he actually was one of the people on the DOE response team to 3 Mile Island. So to show you, he was a lot less gray then, so he was just starting out his life as a health physicist. And he was, one of the members of our team. And, we picked people that were adaptable, like people who have been around a long time and had different kinds of experience. But since everything was a little bit different in the field here, people have a lot of training, decades of training in some cases, but they still have to be able to adapt. Not everybody in the radiation protection world is adaptable. Certain, like people who work at sites, nuclear power plants, for example, health physicists and radiation technicians are very procedure-oriented, and rote procedures didn't necessarily apply in this environment. And also, not everybody in the health physics community is a good communicator. They're very good at being technical and doing their job, but they don't necessarily know how to talk to military commanders and things like that. So I had to have some people that were effective at communications. So now I'll talk about kind of the process. What we do, it involves doing a lot of measurements. Our job is to characterize the radiological environment. We weren't there to monitor the people or monitor the reactor. I mean, they had some NRC personnel there to advise the US government and help advise the Japanese. But our job, our team, both here and abroad, is to characterize the radiological environment. So make measurements, do analysis, and then communicate those results to decision makers and help them make protective action decisions. So our team doesn't make the decisions, we're the technical people. So we help interpret the massive amounts of data and how that can help people make science-informed decisions, is what I like to say. A lot of times people are scared of radiation, most of the time, and they don't know enough, and they kind of wait and don't make decisions, or make decisions not based on science, but based on fear. So our job is to help them make decisions and actually use the best science available at the time. So this is just, and I'll go through a few examples of what we do in each of these phases of using physics in the field. And so, yes?
So excuse me, I'm Mel Eula, Virginia Tech PhD student. Oh, I'm sorry. Hi,
Yes.
I'm Mel Eula, PhD student in Science and Technology Studies at Virginia Tech. So I was curious, when you say that the outcomes of your work as far as doing physics in the field helps inform the decision makers. I don't know if you use that particular term.
Yes.
But I'm curious as to whether knowing how decision makers sometimes reduce down some important elements of detail, is there a feedback loop to you? Was there a feedback loop to your team in order to do a reality check what actually emerged when the information was reduced down for public consumption?
So it's not for public consumption. You mean, well, we interact with decision makers, not the public. So we were giving it to, let's say, the ambassador at the U.S. Embassy, or the commanding staff at U.S. Forces Japan, or people in the government of Japan. But as far as a feedback loop, yeah, we would make maps, and I'll show you some examples, summarizing radiation measurements, and we'd get like, okay, what does this mean? We don't understand REMS, RADs, Grays, Sieverts, Becquerels. What are we supposed to do with this? So it took a little bit of iteration because we were interacting with different people. Normally we interact with people in, let's say, a public health department or the radiation protection department at a state, and they understand the kind of information we provide, and we understand the kind of decisions they have to make. But one example was we were working with the U.S. Forces Japan commanders there, and they wanted to know how long their troops could stay places and do humanitarian assistance operations. So instead of our normal map showing, we made a map where it took our data, translated it into how long can they stay in a given area and not exceed the radiation dose that they're allowed to get based on whatever their military guidance is. So we had some, iterations there, refining products, saying, does this help you make your military command decisions? And they said, yes, that helps. Does that answer your question? Yes. Okay. And that happened a lot throughout it. And so we learned a lot. And one thing that I've learned since then is sometimes we used to think that we should train the senior decision makers how to interpret our products. But in working in various White House working groups, I realized that's completely the backwards approach. We should, because the senior leaders, they think a certain way, and they don't care whether it's a radiological incident, chem, bio, storm, outbreak, it doesn't matter. They think, how do I, minimize loss and minimize suffering, and if it's a threat, stop the bad guy. So we have to frame our data or our products to meet the way they think and not train them to understand the way we think. So I've tried to factor that into some of our work as we create our informational products for them. So in the field, we did different kinds of measurements. The workhorse of what we did was our aerial measurements. And I guess I should have said, so we have these different radiation measurement capabilities in the United States, specialized teams, which we pulled from to do this in Japan. And so I don't talk about all the acronyms because, we sort of put together a specialized set of people for this. So I'll just talk about the concepts and the capabilities. But this is all stuff that we have ready to do response in the United States. So we did radiation measurements from the air. So it's like taking a radiation detector, which you can see in the lower left of the screen. I don't know if it doesn't work on the screen, but the black box at the bottom of the computer screen, that's the radiation detector, very sensitive, and we fly the aircraft back and forth. It's kind of like mowing the lawn at 500 or 1,000 feet above the ground. So you have a pattern, and then you make a map that shows what the radiation footprint looks like on the ground. So it's mapping where radioactive material has been deposited on the surface. And then that's used to have analysts combine all that data. And eventually we started working jointly with the Japanese, and we had their aircraft as well. So why would we do this? Well, it was supporting some of the relocation decisions. Where can the Japanese population live or not live for the next year? And I'll show you a map. Where can the humanitarian assistance operations proceed safely? If you're going to deliver goods to the Japanese, you want to find out how safe is it to be there and should they be there. So that's kind of why we did that. We also did some associated ground-based monitoring where using the normal survey meters that you might think of, as well as digging soil samples, collecting air samples, putting detectors on a tripod and measuring what was on the ground. We call that an in situ measurement. And we weren't blanketing the whole countryside with measurements. That was what the Japanese were doing. Our goal was really to make our aerial surveys as defensible as possible and as accurate as possible. Because they didn't have the capability to measure the huge area that we did from the air. I mean, they had a capability, but it wasn't as mature, and theirs was a commercial helicopter supporting they leased a helicopter. And the commercial helicopter wasn't willing to fly anywhere near the nuclear power plant, go figure. So we were flying our technicians and equipment on United States Air Force aircraft, and they were willing to go wherever we told them to go. And I'll keep that in mind when I talk about radiation awareness training at the end. That's important. So you collect massive amounts of data, and then you have to analyze it. So we had people in the field as well as people back home at our laboratory doing quality control, doing additional analysis, taking what's measured on the ground, turning it into dose assessment. How much dose would a person receive if they lived in this place for 1 year, just as an example? Or how much dose would they receive by eating crops harvested in this field, making a lot of assumptions, of course, but doing that kind of analysis. And we were in Japan for 2.5 months, so we hadn't usually thought about responding for that long, believe it or not. When we say emergency response, we think days or a few weeks. But we had so much data over such a long period of time, we started having to look at the data in different ways, doing trend analyses instead of looking things at a point in time. And then there were a lot of real-world challenges. We had data from ourselves, from military people that had radiation detectors, and they would send us data. Data from the Japanese. They were posting a lot initially in scanned PDFs in Japanese. So we had a real-world challenge. When I say data in different languages, I mean sometimes literally in Japanese, as well as in different units, becquerels versus curies, sieverts versus rem. So our scientists had to translate all that and put it in some coherent form in our giant database, which at the end of this, we had over 1 million data points. And then also another aspect of assessment is what ifs. A lot of people at the White House would say, what if all the reactors blew up at the same time and the weather drifted towards Tokyo for 24 hours? What if that happened? You know, what would be our concerns? And first of all, that was not realistic, and the weather never blows in that direction for that long. But people who don't understand radiation just want to hypothesize and figure what are, you know, worst case scenarios. So we had to do those kind of assessments as well. And then you can do all the technical calculations in the world, but unless you can communicate what it means, then all those measurements are for naught. So, you know, we had to, got questions about what material was released off-site. Is depending on what the material is, it impacts what the dose to the population is. And then they wanted to know if what material was deposited exceeded the evacuation and relocation guides for the public. And interestingly, the actual doses in the US as far as guidelines, but they calculate things differently because they take into account living in a house reduces your dose a little bit. So there's communicating some of the subtleties is very challenging. There are also questions about personnel safety, and I'll talk about that when I talk about training various responders. You know, what are the health concerns for the DOE responders there? Just as an aside, none of our responders ever received a recordable dose. We all had dosimeters, real-time dosimeters. Some people went home for whole body counting at the end if they had been out in the field a lot. But nobody received anything that was recordable as far as a cumulative dose during their stay in Japan, despite people having flown directly over the power plant multiple times. You know, and then what's interesting is this sign was at the entrance to Yokota Air Base, and you can see that, you know, it's weird. Normally it would say, welcome to Yokota Air Base or welcome so-and-so, and so here they have, you know, a sign about the radiation. Also, when we went to the commissary, so the, you know, grocery store on base, early on, there's a sign above the Fuji apples saying, you know, don't worry, these have been stored in a warehouse since, you know, last October. So people weren't worried about buying Fuji apples from Japan. So here's an example. This is what I call the final product on the left of our joint survey between the US and the Japanese. We did surveys all along, mapping out various parts of this radiation footprint, I'll call it, on the ground. But this was a project we did with the Japanese. Our aircraft flew everything between 0 and 60 kilometers, and the Japanese aircraft, which they want to fly near the red or yellow area, flew in that outer ring, which is actually a big area. It looks small, but, you know, since it's so far out there. And what I have on the right is a map of the Government of Japan evacuation area. See the pink, that kind of squiggly thing at the outside is what they call their deliberate evacuation area. And then the orange is the evacuation prepared area. So the deliberate one, initially when they made very early evacuation decisions, but close in, not based on actual measurements, based on, you know, normal, like we have in the United States, EPZs, you know, evacuation preparedness zones, emergency preparedness zones. But our aerial survey led to them being able to make a more science-informed relocation decision. So the outline of the yellow is roughly comparable to their protective action guide for people should relocate from that area for a year. Now granted, the doses for protective action guides are very conservative. So as a DOE radiation worker, I could be there for 1 year and not exceed my occupational dose of 5 rem. But for the population, you know, they're not allowed to receive more than 2 rem in the first year following some accident. So it's very conservative. It's not like they're having ill health effects, but that's what the protective action guides suggest. And so the map on the left, or an earlier iteration of it, was used to inform the shape of that pink boundary. So that's an example of how our data get translated into protective action decisions So it's not exactly the same because it's kind of hard to, you don't want to evacuate somebody on one side of the street, not the other. So they translated that into, following town boundaries. So instead of evacuating half a town or half of some area, they just do it in things that are more manageable. So they take the technical information and as like a recommendation and turn it into a decision, which is what's on the right side of the screen. And that's the way it works in the United States. We make measurements and give them to decision makers, and they would draw evacuation and shelter boundaries. They would determine what areas should be agriculturally embargoed, things like that. So that's a pretty standard decision: evacuation, sheltering, relocation. We also had some non-standard questions. So someone at the embassy asked, so is it safe for us to ride the bullet train? Because the bullet train went from Tokyo up to Sendai, which is way up north, and you see it goes through that 80-kilometer zone. So people who don't understand about radiation, they were worried. So we decided to make them feel comfortable, even if we know the technical answer just based on some calculations. To make it more concrete, we took somebody, one of our techs, scientists, put them on the bullet train in Tokyo and had them ride it all the way up to Sendai and back, and then record radiation readings all the way. And the map on the right shows a few of those spot readings, and the little strip chart in the middle shows the radiation reading all along the trip. And you can't see the units, but it was very low, and the whole 2.5-hour trip from between Tokyo and Sendai would have been an average dose about 40 micro-R, which is very tiny. And you see what's interesting is there's the low flat area, and that's where it went through the station. And so people were confused. Turns out that's where they had hosed down the station platform. So that's why it's low there, and there's other low spots because the bullet train goes through a lot of tunnels. So we did this measurement to answer a specific question and just give people that warm, fuzzy feeling that certain activity is safe. We had other questions like this: are we allowed to drive the highways? Other things. So that's an example about communication. Another thing that I put together, speaking of communication, was after time we were able to teach people what exposure rate meant, micro-R and things like that, but they didn't understand contamination. So tried to make a little cheat sheet which put everything on an even scale. I mean, people could understand getting an increased risk of cancer. You have a 1 in 10,000 chance of getting cancer because of this particular dose. But they didn't understand contamination. So we try to put them, for this particular scenario, put everything on a roughly equal footing. So whether you're talking dose rate on the left or contamination in the middle or actual total dose or increased cancer. So if you look across, everything is comparable. So a dose rate of 20 microsieverts per hour translates into this kind of increased risk of cancer long term. So this little fact sheet helped people. So that's kind of a summary of what we did during the response. And now I want to talk about sort of the ingredients of effective emergency response in general. And then I'll talk about what we've done to make this even better. So to do emergency response, obviously you need people. It's not just about putting radiation monitors out in the countryside and recording stuff over the internet. And these people need specific skills and certifications, which it's up to us to define. And obviously you need to find a pool of people. We happen to use the DOE national laboratories, but the pool of radiation professionals in the United States is going down steadily, and there's not this large influx of people coming up through the ranks to replace them. So availability is actually becoming an issue. And the National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurement has a committee to address that and come up with some national level guidance. So once you have people, we typically would use people that have the basic skills. We're not going to teach somebody to be a health physicist from scratch, but they need some additional training to help do, physics in the field. Like I said, we put our people through incident command system training, as you know, one of the attendees here took just for fun. And some people like it, some people don't. So we have to define what kind of additional training they need to be effective in the field, and how often they need that training. You know, things that they do as a matter of course. Obviously, they don't need a lot of frequency in that training, but things that they do very infrequently or are very important and critical in the field, we need more training on that. Equipment, that's an important piece of emergency response. I'm not going to talk about that. And how we organize, how we do exercises to bring everybody together, because training and exercises are very different. And some people try and mix them up, like, oh, let's do an exercise and that'll be training. But exercises don't give you the basic skills. Exercises are meant to sort of put into practice all of the training you take. Another thing I'll talk about as far as organization is having enough people. I talked about not having enough radiation professionals. So for a large response, which, believe it or not, this was a relatively large response for us, and if it were in the United States, you know, the additional amount of resources we would need would be huge. So we've been thinking about ways to augment the pool of people that we have dedicated to our efforts, because you can't afford to have that many people full-time dedicated to emergency response. So it's all about readiness. And you know, we try and, for senior leaders, again, we don't want to teach them to think the way we do and don't want them to think about the people and the training and the equipment. So they like to think in, you know, simple metrics. So we score our readiness and try and raise it up to look at our people, our training, that's what T is, look at our equipment or the condition of our equipment. And we have some metrics for how to determine, you know, what's our state. And then we roll it all up to some overall score. And the numbers range from, you know, 1 is good, 4 is really bad, means like we can't go out the door and respond. So we try and make it really simple. So senior leaders, they can say, oh, the team is ready or it's not. You know, 1, it's ready, 4, it's broken. And that way senior leaders, it's just a flag for them to dive in and ask us to explain things. But you know, we look sort of more under the covers. So now I want to switch gears and focus on the training. And I'll look at a few different aspects and the evolution of our training. In March 2011, and I'm focusing on our teams for most of this. In March 2011, we had, you know, way we did training, we have specialized positions in the field. You know, the person who does the aerial surveys is trained differently from the person who does the ground measurements, is trained differently from the data analyst who sits back and analyzes the data. And that person is trained differently from the person who makes the maps. So we have all these different positions, and they have different training and different background. Now, so let's say the person who's assigned to do the analysis. So all the personnel filling a different position, they're trained the same way. And they have the same list of courses, and nominally, you know, being a health physicist or a field monitoring person, but they were all trained to the same level of proficiency. And what we learned during Japan is there were a lot of problems that were more complicated than your average problem. It's not, you know, I guess emergency response is never as organized as an exercise script. So, and the reactor scenario in Japan was more complicated than anything people had forecast. Even, you know, the scenarios that people would use for exercise in the United States, nobody dreamt up having 4 reactors and multiple spent fuel pools all releasing material at the same time, or actually at different times for different durations. So that was very complicated to analyze from our measurement perspective and from the predictive modeling perspective. So we learned that very few of our scientists had the requisite skills and experience to tackle some of these broad, unstructured, you know, previously unheard of problems. So how are we today? So both to tackle the large amount of work that's needed and the range of difficulty, some simple problems, some very difficult, we've changed to a tiered approach to our training. And borrowing from the incident command system where they talk about typing of resources or even of people, there's like type 1 is considered really robust capability, and type 2 and 3 are lesser trained or lesser capable. You know, they talk about in a fire department, you can have a type 1, you know, firehouse and type 3, depending on how many, you know, fire trucks and what kind of fire trucks they have. So we borrowed that concept. So for example, our type 1 assessment scientist knows how to use all of the software tools to do analysis and tackle all kinds of dose assessment problems that we might encounter, and be able to operate independently without any supervision and be able to think about broad unstructured problems. A type 3 maybe doesn't do it as often, so they can't figure out how to tackle some problem that they haven't been trained on. So maybe they'll be given some guidance of one of these more senior scientists, and they can go do a specific calculation over and over again. You know, they can do it really well once they are given guidance. So we have more people at our disposal. So we have a smaller number that are very well trained and a larger number that have a less diverse kind of training. So instead of, so we do have our people taking more training overall, but let's say we have, you know, twice as many personnel available to us. It doesn't mean that we're spending twice as many training hours training all of them, because some of them are you know, doing less training and do it more as a collateral duty. And so I said that gave us more personnel available, sort of as a core group, and some higher level problem solvers. And then also it's more sustainable. So instead of realizing that in Japan people weren't trained enough, if we decided all of the people needed more training and we needed more people, we never would have been able to afford people's time. People wouldn't have been able to commit the time and stay as proficient. Even if we could, you know, have 100% of their time, it's hard to maintain proficiency in such a broad variety of skill sets. So that's why this model is more sustainable for us. We've also been applying this to the medical field. Besides doing environmental monitoring, we do have a small group in Oak Ridge, Tennessee that does medical management of radiation injuries. And they're subject matter experts, both doctors, nurse paramedics, and health physicists. And they've been doing it for decades, and they teach people around the country to be able to basically do their medical job in spite of the presence of radiation. Because people are afraid of radiation, and doctors, even oncologists, you know, are no different from anybody, and they're just as afraid of dealing with a contaminated patient as anybody. So our personnel in Oak Ridge train people to, you know, do their job despite the presence of radiation. So our people are kind of like the top subject matter experts in the pyramid, the subject matter experts. But throughout the healthcare industry or profession, you need people to have some awareness. Even the security guards and the orderlies at a hospital, you don't want to have a security guard not let people into the emergency room because he's afraid that that contaminated individual is going to, you know, kill him. Or the orderlies for moving patients around. So even the lowest tier or lowest group, people that deal with the contaminated casualties the least, they have to have some awareness. So they kind of keep the whole healthcare machinery operating. So this tiered approach is something that we in an interagency group are working to implement over time, of course, because, you know, we may train a couple of thousand people a year with our group around the country, but if you add up, you know, all the people in the healthcare profession, you know, you'd be having hundreds of thousands or 500,000 doctors alone in the United States. So obviously we have to, you know, take a long time, and that's why, you know, it could be as little as maybe 30 minutes or an hour of some web-based training for people at the bottom of this pyramid. So that's a tiered approach on the medical side, kind of what I talked about from our core responders. And just to sort of highlight how training those people, let's say at the bottom, are. So in Japan, here's some examples of the right way and the wrong way to deal with basic radiation awareness. When we first arrived in Japan, we were going to do ground-based measurements, so traveling hundreds of miles, because we were based about 120 miles south of where Fukushima Daiichi was. So we had a lot of ground to cover. And because they drive on the wrong side of the road compared to us, and the signs are in Japanese, and we didn't know the terrain, and people were going to be working long hours, I decreed that our team wouldn't be driving, so we needed drivers. So initially we used the US Embassy, their motor pool. And so we started out by having them come pick us up, and we take all our detectors and get in their vehicles and tell them where we want to go. And our teams get out of the vehicles and put on their little rubber gloves, get out their survey meters, sometimes put on the little booties in case they're going to be walking on contaminated ground. And they have their little dosimeters on their lapel. And the embassy drivers got afraid. And well, they didn't tell us that, but they went back to the embassy, and I guess they told their supervisor that they were afraid, and they didn't want to do this anymore because they were afraid of the radiation. So we learned the wrong way, and we didn't give them a little radiation 101 about what we were doing and why we're doing it. Why are we putting on gloves or booties? Or what are these things on our lapels? So we had to come up with a plan B, and the plan B was using people from the motor pool on the base where we were. So first thing we did was give them a little just-in-time training. So this is radiation, this is why we're doing this. We put these boots on, because if there's something on the ground, we don't want to bring it into the vehicle. We wear these dosimeters just in case, and here you can wear one too. So we told them what we were doing and explained it, and they are perfectly happy. And they loved supporting the mission because they felt they were doing something useful. The pilots and the mechanics that flew us, the first thing we did is we briefed the pilots on flying the mission and talked about the potential, what they would ask about, are we going to get contaminated? Is this dangerous? The mechanics worried about if they're maintaining the aircraft when it comes back. Are they going to get contaminated or radiated when they work on aircraft parts? So we explained things to them, and they were very comfortable. In fact, when one of the pilots was asked if he felt safe, and also our personnel were flying all the time with the pilots. You're never sending the pilots off by themselves. And you saw the huge and very sensitive radiation detectors in the aircraft, and we explained that to them. So they said, well, as long as Dr. Lyons or Dr. Walciolik are sitting behind me, we feel perfectly safe. So it's both teaching them and the fact that we were there and we were perfectly comfortable made them perfectly comfortable. Also, we explained to them that we had this huge sensitive detector in the aircraft, and it was a lot more sensitive than any dosimeter or anything that somebody would hand them. In fact, they had a rule at the airbase: when any aircraft landed there, they would make the environmental folks from the Air Force come and survey the outside of the aircraft to make sure it wasn't contaminated. And they would walk around in these full Tyvek suits and wave the survey meter over the propellers or the engine intake. And our people thought it was very amusing because they had a small survey meter and we had a giant detector inside that was way more sensitive than the survey meter. But that was their process. Not every aircraft had huge detectors on board except ours. But to show how it does make a difference, our aircraft were never contaminated to the point of making the mission less sensitive or requiring it to be decontaminated over that 2.5 months that we used them. Whereas there were some helicopters that the Marines used just for transport to go up north. And those aircraft got seriously contaminated, and they had to be taken apart, and like places where there was grease, which trapped radioactive material, they had to use basically Mr. Clean and decontaminate it and spend weeks doing it. A lot of lessons learned there. But our aircraft never got contaminated, mostly because our personnel were on board, and we had huge sensitive detectors and knew how to avoid any potential contamination. So the other just-in-time training we did is we followed up on our lesson learned with our military drivers and our embassy drivers. There were certain places where even the military wasn't allowed to go. mean, we were allowed to go, but they had very strict rules, and they couldn't drive us far up north, partly because it would require them to stay overnight, and they weren't allowed to incur overnight expenses. So we hired a commercial tour operator, who is used to taking people on tours. They had tour buses, and they would arrange hotels and do all that. If we wanted to go sightseeing, they probably would have done that too. But we told them what we were doing, explained the mission and the radiation, and they were happy to help us. And in fact, after we spent a few days up north, we came back. They wrote us a letter and said, if you need any more missions up north, we're happy to help and provide this support, and they felt like they were doing something good. That's kind of the right and wrong way to deal with radiation awareness for novices. So now I'll turn to surge capacity, a general concept of if you have a large response and need more people, what do you do? Like we can't afford to have, I'll call it a whole army of people available all the time. So there's different ways to make something happen. You could put together a reserve corps, like FEMA has a reserve corps. EPA, for example, people who work at EPA, they sign up saying what kind of skills they have, and if there's a response, same as FEMA, what kind of things they could do if needed, separate from their day job, whether it's being a driver or an admin assistant or someone in contracts. Everyone has a skill, and FEMA is really good about pulling them in however needed. So one could either keep a list of all the people, but that takes a lot of work, and you have to track people. So since we're not looking for specific bodies, we're looking for specialties. We need health physicists. We need people who are experts in material science or the properties of plutonium dispersal and inhalation, or how it gets taken up by the body. So we're looking for specific expertise. So one thing that we've started to put in place through our Department of Energy National Laboratories is sort of catalog what their strengths are, because not all the labs are created equal. Certain labs are very good in radiation detection, some are good on the computing side, some have large radiation protection cadres. For example, Savannah River site, which is still a large and active site, they have a lot of radiation technicians. So we're cataloging what strength areas the different DOE national laboratories have, so that if some large response happens and our initial response force is exhausted or overwhelmed, then we have some time, we can reach out to the sites through their lab directors and say, hey, we need some more field monitors, or we need someone who's an expert in air sampling. So our reserve corps isn't specific people, it's cataloging specific capabilities that we can draw from. And then, so that's internal to our department. Something that we're working with FEMA to develop is something called the Radiological Operations Support Specialist. And it'd be a volunteer type position. Think of being a volunteer fireman. Well, if you happen to be a health physicist, you could be the volunteer version of that. If there's a radiological incident, whether it's large scale or local, we're working to create a registry, put them in something like the Medical Reserve Corps, which you may have heard of. It's administered at the county level. And I know it's called the Medical Reserve Corps, but it actually has other types of volunteer positions in it for responding to emergencies. So this is an asset that it doesn't belong to DOE or FEMA. It's really a tool for the state and local responders. And it would use experienced radiation professionals. It wouldn't be training someone to be a radiation professional. It's just I guess maybe volunteer fire department's not quite the same, because they probably train people to actually fight fires. They don't just try and find existing firefighters. We're looking to find experienced health physicists, radiation technicians, and train them in response. So send them to incident command system classes and things like that. And then they'd be registered and be available. So if something happens in a particular state, they look through the registry and say, hey, there's some health physicists in Alexandria. We can call them up and see if they can help at the incident command post or operations center. So that's something that is currently under development with FEMA and our department. And that's it, and ready to take any and all questions. Yes.
So thank you for the talk. I had two questions. So I'm Kenneth Wong. I'm the director for our center over in Falls Church, and I'm with the graduate school in the physics department at Tech. So my first question is, given the missions that you were flying, how feasible is it to do that with autonomous vehicles? And the second question is, how do you groom and train tier one people? I mean, do you have to sort of find them within your organization, or is there a process by which you can identify people who could be tier one and then move them up to that level?
Both. So the first one is on the unmanned systems. There is a role, and so we've been working to develop an unmanned pod to fly on some UAVs in the United States for some time, and we see it as augmentation, not a replacement. And a better example is in Japan. Since 2011, they've continued doing aerial surveys every year, and for a lot of different purposes. They've developed a lot of new tools. So they have the manned system, like I showed, detectors sitting in a helicopter with people monitoring it and pilots flying it. And then they have an unmanned helicopter, remote controlled, a little smaller. They have an unmanned airplane, and they also have a really small quadcopter, which can only fly about 10 or 15 minutes. And so they see each of those as having a different mission. So the smaller helicopter or plane flying lower and slower and being more sensitive over small areas, for example, is a particular rice field uncontaminated enough to plant rice. So if contamination or just weathering or decay, is it safe? As opposed to, nothing can replace the helicopter or our airplane to fly really large areas. Also, there's something to be said for the person in the loop. When we're flying, at least in the emergency phase, you want to get information very quickly. So just collect and not sort of doing on the fly, no pun intended, quality control and validation that what we're collecting will be useful when we land and be able to make maps like this. Also, the person in the loop, having someone very experienced, it is what it takes to avoid flying through, let's say radiological hazards. We don't intentionally want to fly through any plumes, and we would try and get a sense of where there might be plumes floating around and not fly there, but the weather is complicated. So our people are trained to know if what they're detecting is something airborne versus something that's on the ground and just a hot spot. And they would have the pilots turn the other way. So I think there's a role for unmanned systems, and it's just sort of another tool in the toolbox. And then as far as, where do you get these, super scientists? I think it's both. We have people that join the program and just over many years learn a lot of skills, and we do refresher training and give them new tools, and they do exercises. But we, people don't stay forever, so people can come up through the ranks, or you hire someone who is a health physicist somewhere, and they come in and you train them, and they understand radiation protection, they understand health physics, they understand dose. Maybe they don't understand the specifics of the EPA protective action guides, or we have to teach them how to run our particular dose assessment tools. So it's a hybrid.
Hi, Jeff Glick, an adjunct professor here at Virginia Tech. Wondering, early on in your lecture, you said that your findings agreed with what the Japanese were coming up with, and so you had sort of a consensus as to what was going on. Hypothetically, what happens if that wasn't the case, that your team found or interpreted the situation to be, say, more dire than they did? How do you think that relationship would have gone forth, and what would ultimately have happened, do you think?
Well, I guess you'd have to hopefully look at it at the technical level first. You know, data validation and quality control are always a big part of what we're doing. So if there's differences in the measurements, what causes them? And then as far as what decisions there are, it's to be their country. It would be no different from in the United States, I guess. But here, there are, you know, different resources doing the same thing. But it will be up to them to make a decision on what set of information to use as a basis for their decisions. I mean, early on, the Japanese set a certain area for evacuation, but I don't know if you recall, the Americans set 50 miles or 80 kilometers as this exclusion zone, they call it. They don't want to call it evacuation or relocation. They want to come up with a generic term. And they said, within this 80-kilometer zone, you know, all the Americans should leave. And actually, that was a big point of contention between the, you know, Japanese and the Americans for a while, because why is America saying 80 kilometers is a place where we don't want Americans, but the Japanese are saying something different?
Patrick Malone, I'm a reporter with the Center for Public Integrity in Washington. My question has to do with sort of how Fukushima informed NNSA on its decisions for preparation at its sites related to that sort of low probability, high consequence event. I know there's the seismic standards and the safety bases around that we're seeing some resistance to at some of the sites that say, yeah, we know if there's an earthquake at Los Alamos, it's going to be trouble, but we think it's a very unlikely event. How has NNSA been informed by Fukushima in that regard of the low probability, high consequence event?
So our job is doing off-site response, so I'm not involved and I'm not aware of how NSA has, or DOE sites for that matter, have evolved in terms of their, you know, safety basis for their sites. I don't know.
Nothing's changed.
What? I said I'm not involved in site standards or guidance.
Yes, hi, Philip Eggert. I'm a PhD candidate here in the STS program at Virginia Tech. At the very beginning of your talk, you said when your team arrived in Japan, you found that they had no national framework or command and center system in place. Would one of the lessons from that be the need to establish those types of systems at an international level, maybe through the IAEA, where other countries have nuclear power plants and also don't have these systems in place?
So, no, I didn't mean to say that they didn't have a system in place. I mean, they had a way of doing command and control and response. I mean, they're a very developed nuclear country. And so just like we have our NRC and FEMA, they have basically a preparedness program. It's different from us now. Maybe when I said that they didn't have the aerial measuring capability that I was talking about, the same as we had. I mean, that's all. But as far as their command and control and their coordination, they had a system in place and national frameworks and all that. Now they've done a lot of work to revise that and change that over the past 5 years. In fact, they changed what agencies are responsible for what. They created the entire Nuclear Regulation Authority, their version of the NRC. They created a whole new cabinet office, which is like the cabinet office for, you know, nuclear emergency preparedness, to consolidate, you know, roles and responsibilities. But they had a whole response and preparedness framework ahead of time.
So I'll take your question in just a second. We have some online questions as well. So just a reminder to our online participants, if you want to submit a question, please email it to siren@vt.edu. So the first question here is from Wolfgang Weiss, a physician from Germany who is involved in the ongoing, I'm not sure how to pronounce this acronym, UNSCEAR UNSCARE assessment. So he writes, you mentioned ground-based air measurements aiming at the assessment of the contribution of inhalation to the total dose. There's an ongoing discussion in UNSCARE about the relative importance of different forms of iodine, elementary, gaseous, or organic, during the early phase of the accident. My question, do you have specific information on this kind, and where is it published?
Yes, so we actually did, I don't remember the details, but we did air sampling early on, and we did different kinds of air samples using different kinds of filters that could look for the different contributions of the different forms of iodine. And I know all of our results are published on what's called data.gov, so data.gov. And you could probably just go to data.gov and in the search box type in NNSA Fukushima, and it'll have all of our ground measurements, our soil samples, our air samples. So the basic results will be there. And I think it even has my email to contact for additional information, like if somebody doesn't understand what the sampling methods are.
Great, thank you. The other question is from Paul Rocket, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Consultant at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Hi, Paul.
He asks, could you describe the procedure by which the Japanese government initially requested US or DOE support following the Fukushima explosions? Were there prior agreements in place for aid that enabled our response? And perhaps in connection with that, could you mention what this Operation Tomodachi exactly entailed?
Sure. So how did they request support? Actually, our departure from the United States was based on a White House request to meet the needs of the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and United States Forces Japan. So our initial response was to help U.S. assets, personnel in Japan. And the Japanese made a request, I don't know if it was through the White House or through the State Department, for assistance, for our type of assistance. Not right away, but it turned out the initial request came while we were on our way. So the White House could say, oh, they'll be there in 2 hours, which is pretty amazing since it takes 22 hours to get there. So that was good. And then we started, a couple of days into it, we started with sort of high-level meetings with various ministries, representatives from ministries, and we showed them what we could do at least from our perspective. There had already been requests and accepted offers of the humanitarian assistance from the very beginning, from the military there, and from the USAID Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. But as far as our type of assistance, we basically would go to a meeting and I put out a big D-size map that showed our aerial survey from the first day, and eyes wide open. It's like, wow, this is very useful information. And so we built a good working relationship at the technical level very quickly. We would basically show them a map and ask them to draw with a Sharpie what were the next areas that were important to survey, and we would go survey them. And over time, we did this joint planning and then migrated into joint analysis of the data. As far as Operation Tomodachi, I guess the military never do anything without naming what their operation, whether Desert Storm or Iraqi Freedom. So they named their humanitarian assistance operation, Operation Tomodachi. And Tomodachi is friend in Japanese. And so we were helping part of the military operation. We weren't doing humanitarian assistance, but we just sort of fell in with the military. And so we were part of Operation Tomodachi.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I was actually in Japan also in June supporting the NRC's interaction with the government of Japan and TEPCO. And I just want to, a lot of people Antonio Zulis, I'm sorry. Antonio Zulis currently at the Department of Homeland Security.
What part?
In the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office.
Okay. That's where I spent 4 years.
One thing that I'm curious from your perspective, a lot of people focused on the nuclear accident, but there was a tsunami that killed 10,000 people, and that was kind of overwhelmed by the nuclear accident. But in terms of the releases and the contamination levels, even though it was 4 units, 4 spent fuel pools, et cetera, how would you rate this? I mean, is it a very serious accident? I mean, I understand it's a serious accident. But in terms of really, nobody died from the accident. There was no deaths. What is your feeling about that compared to like Chernobyl or other accidents?
Well, like I said, nobody died. The only ill effects of the evacuation were from evacuating people. Some that had heart attacks or had other health problems. But there was no impact from the radiation, and there won't be any real or noticeable cancer risks. So as far as actual health effects, certainly it was a large-scale environmental release and second largest in the world, but not a large health impact. You can look at the IAEA's report.
Philip Haggard again. I have a follow-up question on a different topic related to lessons learned. A lot of what you talked about could kind of fall under the rubric of risk communication. And there's a large body of literature in the STS world, at least, on risk communication. And what you were saying and the anecdotes you were talking about, particularly like with the drivers and the other people, sort of substantiates that literature. So I was wondering, what has your organization done to bring that new understanding of risk communication back to the United States and introduce it, and what have you done in terms of changing the way you develop risk communication back here?
Let's see. As far as formal changes, I mean, we talk about what we've done. There have been after action reports and lessons learned, but we haven't been involved in any formal, let's say, change in the way FEMA does communications or anything like that. Now that said, I don't recall if this was finalized before or after Fukushima, but FEMA did put together some pre-scripted messages for public messages following a nuclear power plant accident. And we helped craft those messages with both our technical and our public affairs folks. And that's on the FEMA website, so people can go out there and see what are some of the typical questions that might be asked, and what are some suggested pre-canned public messages that a governor or mayor or someone can issue following a large-scale nuclear power plant.
Hi. One question, and yes, I'm David Orsini, a postdoc in the SDS department working on the SIREN project, also with Dr. Sonia Schmidt. So one question is about trust. You mentioned that was an issue, especially with people and the Japanese government. You said you didn't have direct access to the public in terms of communication, or at least your role was kind of filtered. You were
our role, yes.
Right. So I was wondering then if people's awareness of your presence there and your role in the operations was kind of leading towards, basically, how were you perceived on the field when you were doing your job?
So I'm not sure what the average Japanese public thought of what we were doing, because I said we didn't interact with them. I mean, I do remember one situation where people set up a detector to make a measurement in an air sample somewhere, and I think they were parked in like a convenience store or someplace, and the people didn't like it because it didn't look good, having these people make measurements. But aside from that, I think we were relatively well welcomed. A contrast was the IAEA sent in a team to make some measurements in various towns, and I do recall it was in the news while we were there that particular team was kicked out of the town by the mayor where they were. So we were never kicked out of any town. So maybe that's just an empirical answer to your question.
What can I briefly ask if you have any idea of why? I mean, what is the difference between, an international team being kicked out and, your perception?
Well, I don't know. Maybe the mayor didn't like either the intrusion from the IAEA or what it meant. Maybe if a team is there monitoring for radiation, he thinks that it, might scare his residents more, because if a team is there monitoring radiation, then it must be dangerous. So I'm not sure what the reason was.
Okay. Just a brief comment about the consequences. I would push back against the no consequences narrative, just because an entire community was wiped out, basically, of their, in terms of livelihood. I mean, it's an entire area that is contaminated. People cannot live there.
Oh, when I said no consequences, I meant radiological.
Right.
There
Exactly.
are huge consequences.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
To make that
That's a
clear.
good point.
Right.
I mean, that's why people have talked about the risk of evacuation and whether they should have even done the evacuations or not. Exactly.
Any other questions, comments? Well, I have one, exposing my ignorance here, but you're showing us these concentric circles here, and I was wondering, did you also do aerial monitoring above the surface of the ocean? And
Yes.
if so, is there a difference between, how do you measure radiation on a moving target, so to speak?
That's a very good question. Yeah, I didn't show that because I didn't want to get too much into data. But normally, we fly over water when we want to measure background, because the ground has radioactive material in it all the time. So there's just natural background radiation, but there's no natural background radiation in the water. So we use that as our benchmark for what background really is. So if, let's say, the aircraft is contaminated a little bit, or any internal radiation, if we fly over the water, whatever we measure, we say is just coming from the air and from the aircraft. But when we were flying over the water there once, something didn't seem right. The count rate didn't go back down the way it should. So we decided to do a large area survey over the water. And we made a map, and it showed a shape, not that shape, but it showed contours and a hot spot. And interestingly, it wasn't right off the coast of the plant. It was a little bit south of it. So it showed the strange ocean currents. And we did this a few times, and it was in different places each time. So it showed that the current is taking the radioactive material that's near the surface of the water and moving it around. It wasn't that, it was just a diffusion from the power plant in a uniform way. Everyone says, dilution is the solution. But when you have the strange currents, it kept the material concentrated more than you'd think. So it was the first time we'd ever done aerial surveys over a large body of water. And obviously what we're measuring is near the very surface, because the water shields the radiation. So if there's anything on the bottom, we're not going to see it. We're just looking at what's in the top foot or so of the water.
Okay, there's another online question here from George Vessier. Actually, he was the last speaker we had in this series from the Netherlands, a consultant. He writes, I did not understand whether the U.S. mission was on request by the Japanese or a voluntary support by the U.S. Were they assigned specific tasks, or were they operating in parallel to Japanese investigators?
So our initial response was at the request of the United States government. So the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo and the U.S. military in Japan wanted assistance to help understand the situation for the American citizens and the U.S. military personnel. There are about 80,000 of them in Japan. So that's why we left the U.S. to go over there. And then we started working with the Japanese. Once they saw the kind of information that we had to offer, they're very eager to work with us and take that information and work collaboratively to help collect more information. So it went from, here's what we've done, to let's work together to figure out where should we monitor next. And so it went to a collaboration. And like I said, in that aerial survey map, that was a completely joined project. We planned it together, we executed it together. They measured the outer 20 kilometers, and we worked together to analyze it, and even to the level of picking the color scheme, because that's important in communicating the results, is what should the color scheme be. So we let them pick, though.
Okay, another question from Frank Kitching, ISR in Canada. So the pamphlet you used to communicate the radiological risk that you showed us, it still contained a lot of scientific units. Were these units used when making recommendations to decision makers? Did you actually make recommendations or just provide the data? I imagine that decision makers might look for advice in the face of scientific readings, especially if they don't have specific expertise in-house. And then he continues on, have you ever considered making recommendations in terms of percentages? This greatly simplifies certain aspects of risk communication and is easily understood by most. For example, when communicating with a decision maker, you could say, we have reached 75% of the evacuation level in zone X. However, the reading is decreasing as a result of a recent wind shift and evacuation may no longer be required. And this is because the risk of evacuating areas that do not need to be evacuated could result in a loss of life. For example, evacuating a hospital may result in the death of critical care patients.
Right. So the little fact sheet, it does have a lot of the units, but that was just because people heard the units, and we wanted them to say, oh, if I hear this unit, 20 microsieverts per hour, I have no idea what that means. But if I look, it means I'll get maybe a 1 in 200 chance of increased risk of cancer, or it's the same as the dose a radiation worker is allowed to receive each year. So that's why there are units on there. And as far as the maps, an example, so on the left, the aerial survey map, this one is in actual units, but we did make versions that instead of numbers, it would just say, this is the outline of the area that exceeds the guideline for where people should, live or not live for the first year. So we got rid of numbers, and it just says, inside this boundary exceeds the protective action guide for a year, and outside this boundary is okay. Of course, it's never that sharp a line, and then you have to explain to people, yes, it may exceed the guideline for 1 year, but you have to explain to people what it means, like how is it picked, what the dose is for 1 year, and how it's conservative and things like that. So we did make maps, that weren't in becquerels or sieverts or anything like that. They were just, place to evacuate, place not to evacuate. I hope that answers the question.
I guess we'll have to hear back from him if he has a follow-up question. Well, I have one more question, if I may. You mentioned this, the helicopters that the Marines used, or the transportation plane. If your teams and your helicopters never ever picked up anything, why did they get so contaminated?
Because
they
did not have sensitive radiation detectors to let them know when to turn the other way and not fly through something inadvertently. Does that make sense?
It does. But if your team did that, then how could you map the area? Did you come back to that particular area after you assumed the plume had passed, or?
Right.
I understand.
She's saying if we are mapping an area and we decide to turn around because there's a plume there, how do we map what's on the ground? And that's why one reason it did take many flights to create the map is if there is contamination floating around in the air, that confuses the measurement. So you'd have to come back anyway. Because what we want to do is measure what's on the ground, because what's on the ground is what impacts people's safety, where they should live, where they shouldn't live. Until it touches the ground, and if it's just floating around 1,000 feet, it doesn't impact anybody until it rains out or settles out by other mechanisms. by that, and reporting, like instead of just showing this is where you should relocate, that's a kind of an interesting idea to map. This is 50% of the value for where you should relocate. This is 75%. That might be an interesting map to show people.
Any other questions in the room? Well, I could keep asking here. Let me ask one final question. So let's assume you have these nice maps of aerial monitoring and also ground monitoring. What about decontamination? I mean, the Japanese did a lot of large-scale decontamination, removing soil and surface. How do you take that into account in I don't know, adjusting your maps maybe? And B, how, I mean, is there any way that your teams, your kinds of measurements can take into account the food chain, whether even in a not so heavily contaminated area where maybe shelter in place might be or where people could return to relatively soon, wouldn't the use of the land that is, however slightly contaminated over time, nevertheless lead to a cumulative dose? Or is there any way you can account for that?
That's one reason the Japanese have been doing aerial surveys over and over again over these past 5 years, is either just normal decay or weathering. It rains a lot there, so things wash out, they go deep into the soil. Or one thing that I've observed in some of their maps is an area that was contaminated last year because of rain isn't, and then an area downriver that wasn't contaminated is highly contaminated now because things accumulate in a different area. So you don't adjust the map based on some thinking of how things will migrate in the environment. The beauty of these type of measurements is you measure what's actually there. So that's why they keep doing it. So this is what it looked like in April of 2011. So they have maps from 2012, 2013, every year, and they can see, this town is no longer above the area where people can't live there anymore. So we can, and I had other maps, you can look on their websites, the shrinking boundary of the relocation area based on the actual ground measurements that they do, whether it's natural decontamination, so to speak, or active decontamination.
Thank you. Okay, since there are no more questions in the room or online, join me in thanking our speaker. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
And we have food and drinks outside if you want to join us for lunch. Thank you.
Turn it off.